Hi. I wanted to make this video because I've been thinking. And this time I've been thinking about driving. And the reason I've been thinking about driving is because I've heard that driverless cars are coming to the UK, and I'm trying to decide how I feel about that. I know they're already on the roads in America and I think China too. And I've watched them on YouTube cruising around the streets of San Francisco. But still, I find it quite hard to imagine there being cars with no drivers really driving around on the roads in the UK. I think they're already being tested in the UK, but with safety drivers still in the cars. But then apparently the plan is to roll out fully driverless buses and taxis in the UK within the next year or so. So the company behind it is called Waymo, and I think they're named after their mission, which is to provide a way forward in mobility. So they're a sister company to Google, and that's the same company that's operating the driverless taxis in various cities in the US. So it is real, it's already being used elsewhere, and it's coming to the UK. But what will that mean in reality? Will people actually use them? I think in the US, people have been a bit hesitant and not sure whether to trust a driverless car. But the longer they've been in operation, the more that hesitation seems to be reducing. And some people seem to accept them as a normal part of life now. So maybe that will be the same in the UK within a year or two. So I've made a video previously about trust and also one about AI. So this subject of driverless cars seems like quite an interesting overlap. And maybe if you're like me and like to have an opportunity to think about whether or not you should trust the person who's going to drive you somewhere, maybe does that become easier or more difficult with a driverless car? I suppose it ought to be more consistent because it should be the same experience every time. But it doesn't give you any opportunity to use your natural instinct about whether you're safe or not. And then, in terms of it being AI, I suppose at least this form of AI, there's no confusion about whether or not AI is being used. I don't think it's going to be hard to tell whether or not a car has a person driving it. So at least that's one area of AI that will be nice and clear. But should we trust an AI driver? There'd be no point in starting with a little chat because AI will always say what it thinks you want to hear. So really we'd just have to trust the technology behind it, and that the right protocols had been followed to make sure that safety is a priority. And just like with a real driver, we really have no way of knowing for sure whether or not we're safe. So we just have to choose to trust if we want to use public transport. And did you know that you've probably been part of training the AI that's being used for driverless cars? Because every time Google has asked you to click on those squares that contain traffic lights or motorbikes or bridges to prove that you're not a robot, your answers were being used to train that technology. So if we can't trust it, maybe it's our own fault because we clicked on a tree instead of a traffic light. But anyway, for me personally, I don't use many buses or taxis because I live within walking distance of most of the places that I need to get to. So I wouldn't have much use for a driverless car or a bus in my everyday life. I think for it to make a difference to me, it would need to be available for longer journeys, like visiting people in different parts of the country or getting to an airport when I'm taking a trip. And I think it is planned to be available for journeys like that, but not for another year or two. And I do quite like the idea of being driven on a long journey by someone or something that never gets tired. Those signs on the motorway about taking a break are there for a good reason. And I imagine a driverless car would be able to get rid of that risk completely. In fact, I read that they're hoping to reduce accidents by more than 80%, given that most accidents are caused by driver errors. So maybe driverless cars will be a safer option. But what about the cost? So from what I've heard so far, the cost of a driverless taxi will be about 1/3 more than the cost of a traditional taxi. But whether the same would be true for longer journeys, I don't know yet. And then, of course, there's the other cost, which is the potential impact on people's jobs. So the company is saying that it will create a lot of jobs in the new driverless car industry, but it doesn't sound as though it will be anywhere near as many as it might remove, because a huge number of people make a living from driving. So what will happen to them? Will there be other jobs for them to do instead? I mean, maybe initially driverless cars might create a different market for themselves because of the higher prices involved. But over time, the cost is likely to come down, and then it probably really will threaten all of those existing jobs connected to driving. So should we be doing something to stop that? I wonder what the future is for black cab drivers in London. And I remember being told how much training they needed to have of the knowledge. But I actually wonder how much that's already changed since sat-navs and Google Maps came along. And, you know, if there's one thing that I've learned over the years, it's that you can't hold back change. If a new service comes along that appeals to people or saves them money, they'll probably use it, despite what their morals or values might tell them. But then often in the longer term, the novelty wears off and they might return to the things that they really prefer, you know, when they've had a chance to think about it. So maybe we'll all just have to experience it first to be able to decide what we really think. And I haven't actually heard much from other people about how they feel about driverless cars and whether they welcome them or rather it wasn't happening. So I'll be interested to see how people react to this video and whether it generates some comments and some interesting discussions. And I also wonder how people feel about the skill of driving potentially being lost. I've always enjoyed the feeling of being able to drive, and you know, I can't help wondering if it's another skill that AI might be taking away from us, because there might not be any point in learning to drive in the future if something else can do it for us. I passed my driving test when I was 17 and I was really proud of that. I couldn't wait to get behind the wheel and start exploring new places. And I remember me and a friend put a tent in the car and went off for a camping weekend, not knowing where we were going or what would happen. And that was in the days before mobile phones or the internet, so we really were adventuring off into the unknown, and it felt great. And I just can't imagine that feeling quite the same in a driverless car when you have to decide your destination before you get in. But also you'd lose that feeling that comes from being able to drive and knowing what to do and having to make quick decisions and use some skill. And it's also, I think, a nice feeling to spread some goodwill by offering someone a lift or letting someone pull out in front of you and sharing a thumbs up with them. I suppose it would be quite nice to stop road rage, so that could be a potential benefit. So it's interesting to think that the ultimate goal of driverless cars is to move away from the idea of people owning their own cars which are generally parked and doing nothing for most of the time. So that actually seems quite a sensible goal when you look around and see how swamped every town and city is with cars and how quickly it's become like that. So yeah, just in my lifetime, it's gone from not every household having a car to most households having more than one. And when I was a kid, we could still play football in the street because hardly any cars came along. And I'm only in my early 50s. And I can also remember a time when parking wasn't a problem, which is hard to imagine now. And how many cars you have and where you'll park them is now a big consideration for people when choosing where to live. And imagine if you didn't have to think about that anymore. There's so many streets in the UK that don't have any parking for the people who live there or nowhere near enough. Those houses were built at a time when people didn't have cars, so it wasn't factored into the design. The roads often aren't very wide and the houses don't have driveways or garages, so people have to park wherever they can find a space. And given that a lot of households have more than one car these days, there's literally nowhere for people to park. And I did used to live in a street like that, and I'd really try not to take the car out in the evening because I knew if I did, there'd be nowhere to park it when I got back. And when I moved house, I made sure that the next one had a parking space, so I don't have that problem anymore, but I know plenty of people that do. And then driving on roads where cars are parked everywhere can be quite a challenge, especially if there isn't anywhere to pass another car coming the other way. And if that happens, someone has to decide that they'll reverse back. And you have to wait and see who gives in first. I mean, I'm not bad at reversing, but I don't like the pressure of that sort of situation with another car facing you and watching you reverse, especially when there's parked cars either side that you need to try not to bounce your car off of. So I wonder how driverless cars would manage that situation. With real drivers, we tend to look at the other person and try to size up who ought to be the one to do the reversing. And if the other person didn't look very confident, I'd probably accept defeat and I'd do the reversing. But if someone was being a bit aggressive and trying to intimidate me, I'd probably keep staring and see if they back down. And I do know of people who won't ever reverse, so I don't know what happens if two people like that meet in that sort of street. But then, that's the fun of driving. Every time you get in the car, it's an adventure. And I just don't think it would be like that in a driverless car. So do we want to give up the adventures and freedom of driving for the convenience and money saving of not having to learn to drive or to own a car? I mean, I guess people who've never learned how to drive won't realise that it's an adventure that they might have enjoyed. Or maybe they'll just find different adventures instead. And if the service is good enough, maybe we won't miss owning our own cars. It would be strange if within the space of another generation or two, we'll go back to a situation of most people not having cars again. I mean, that would work better for all those streets that don't have any parking spaces. And it would help with all the waste that currently happens with cars parked up and not being used. I mean, it would be a huge change in how we live, so I think it would take a long time to reach that stage. And the service would have to be really good to convince people that they don't need to own their own car. But I think if it would be easy and reliable to get a driverless car every time you wanted to go somewhere, then I think people probably would be happy with that. But then the minute it goes wrong and they can't get one, or they need to wait an hour until the next one is available, then they'll probably want to go back to something that fits their needs better. And there'll always be a business there ready to meet the needs of a customer. There actually was a service a few years ago near to where I live that allowed people to use shared cars, and you could book the car online for when you wanted to use it, and you paid by the hour. And it was a good way to have access to a car without the expense or the responsibility of owning one. And that seemed to be working quite well for a while. There were pickup points dotted around and special parking spaces in really convenient places, to make it even more appealing to people. But then suddenly the company went bust because it was just too expensive to run compared with what people were willing to pay to use the cars. So I wonder if the same thing might happen to driverless cars. They're much more expensive to produce than conventional cars because of the advanced technology. So it's hard to imagine it being easy to make money with a driverless car business. It's probably a good job that the companies behind driverless cars have got deep pockets, because I'm sure the upfront investment will take a long time to recoup if it ever does. But it's certainly an interesting venture to try and change the way that we all think about travel, with a view to making it profitable in the end. And I'm interested to see what happens. So, those are my thoughts about driverless cars and the future of driving. But what do you think? Have you been in a driverless car, or would you never want to? I would love to know about other people's thoughts and experiences if you want to leave a comment. So I hope you've taken something useful from this video, but I think that's all for this time. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!